In the previous lesson, we saw how we can make our Node Express apps a little more data-driven by using a NoSQL database such as MongoDB. And in that lesson, we saw how we could insert data into the database. In this lesson, we'll see how we can get data out of the database and then how we can update the data once it's there. Recall from the previous lesson that we had this architecture in which our client, or the web browser, was communicating with our Node Express server using HTTP. And our database was an instance of MongoDB, and the server was accessing the database using the Mongoose library and a schema that we had set up. We had this form that allowed the user to enter information about a person, their name and age. For instance, we had entered a person named Alexis with age 17, and when we clicked Submit Form, we saw this page that told us that it successfully created the new person and echoed back the name and age. So now let's see what happens when we click the Show All link, because we want to see all of the people who are in our database. When I click the link, I'll go to this page that says here are all the people and lists their names and ages. As you can see, the URI, or the resource that we're requesting from our Node Express server, is /all. Here we see the code that would handle the /all request using the middleware that we implement on this route. This would all be on the server side in the index.js file. As we've seen before, we'll use app.use, specify the route or the path, and then implement the callback function that takes the request and response. Now we're going to use the person.find function in order to conduct our query and find all of the people in the database. To review what we saw last time, this is person.js. In this file, we connect to our database, we define the schema. At the bottom, we make the schema, or the model, available to other JavaScript code by using this line, module.exports equals mongoose.model, passing it the name that we want to use in other JavaScript code, and the schema that we created. Now let's go back to our Node Express code. Person.find is going to use that person schema and find all of the objects or all of the documents in the database. The argument to person.find will be this callback function that takes any error that occurred and then the array of all the people objects that it found in the database. If there's any error, that means something went wrong with our database. So we'll send back this error message using HTML as the content type, 500 as the status code, and the content will be the body of the error message. On the other hand, if allpeople.length equals 0, that means there are no person objects in our database. I'm not sure whether that's a server error or not, but in this case, let's say it's not. We'll send back a 200 OK as the status, but with the message that there are no people. Otherwise, if everything is fine, then we'll render showall.ejs, passing it this object as the argument, where all people is the array of all the people in our database, and we'll call it people. Now we can look at views/showall.ejs. This is the EJS page that will be rendered into HTML and sent back to the user's browser. We're going to create an unordered list, and then if you recall from earlier this week when we talked about EJS, we use this tags here to indicate that what's in between is JavaScript. People is the argument that we passed when we called a render, and because people is an array, we can use the forEach function to apply some function to each element in the people array. That function will take each element, which we'll call a person, and then do the following. For each one, it's going to create a list item. The list item will have a link, and the link will be to the /person resource, or URI, that we'll see coming up. The query that's part of the URL will have a key called name, and its value will be the person's name. To get the person's name into the URL string, I use these tags here that indicate that what's in between is JavaScript that needs to be evaluated. Now that's just creating the link. The text that the user can click on to follow that link would also be the person's name, which we've indicated here. Following that, we have the person's age, and then we're done. So we see here on the All page that we're listing all of the people on the database. And each person's name is a link. When I click on the link, for instance, Alexis, I'll go to this page where I can then update the person's age. We can see that the URI that's being requested is /person, and the query that's being passed as part of the URL is name equals Alexis. That was dynamically generated in the EJS page on the previous slide. So let's see how we create the /person page. Well, just as we had before, this is going to be a route in our Express app. We'll create a variable called search name that we'll get out of the query. Remember, the query contained, in this case, name equals Alexis. Using that key, we can then get the value. Now we want to do another search. In this case, we'll use the person.findOne function. Person.find would return all of the person objects that it found. As you can imagine, person.findOne only returns one object. Which object should it be? In this example, we're going to use a query argument, which is an object that has the name and then the value of what we're searching for. Here we're looking for the person whose name is equal to search name, and search name came from the query. If we didn't pass any query argument, for instance in the previous example, it would just return all of the person objects. Here we're only selecting the objects where the name is equal to, in this case, the search name. Now we have the callback function that will be invoked after we're done with our query. And as we saw before, if there's an error, we'll send back a 500 server error status code and the text of the error. If the person object, which is up here, is null or undefined, that means there was no person in the database with that name. So we'll send back a message indicating that there's no such person with that name. Otherwise, if everything is okay, we'll use the person info EJS page, and we'll render it, and we'll pass the person as the argument, and we'll call it person. Now here we can look at personinfo.ejs to see how we rendered this page. And we're using a form here because I want the user to be able to update this data by submitting a form. The action of the form is /update that we're going to see in the next part of this example, and the method will be post. At the top of the form we see the person's name, and again we're using these EJS tags to indicate that what's in between is JavaScript to be evaluated and then included in our HTML. Now the name that we see here is not actually part of the form, but when we submit this form, we want the next page, that's update, to get the person's name so that it knows which person to update. So we need to somehow send the person's name as part of the form. And I'll do that using an input field with name equals username and value equals the person's name. To make sure that it doesn't appear in the page, I'll use the attribute hidden, which means don't show this in the HTML page, but submit it as part of submitting the form. Now I have the age, I'll have an input field for that, and I'll pre-populate it with the person's age, as we can see here. Last, I have my button for submitting the form. So now in this case, for instance, I change Alexis's age to 18, I click the update button, and I go to this page, which is /update, that tells me that it's updated the age to 18. To wrap up this example, let's see how we implement the update page. As always, we'll define a callback function or a middleware in our Express app. In this case, we need to get the name out of the body of the request. Remember that we're using the body parser middleware that'll create this request.body object. And in our form, we called that hidden input username so we can get it and set update name accordingly. Now before we update the object in the database, we need to get that object out of the database. So again, we'll use the person.findOne function that we saw in the previous example that will return one object from our person database. Which object should it return? Well, we're going to return the object whose name is equal to update name, where update name was defined in the previous line. Now that we get that one person out of the database that has that name, we have our callback function. And as we saw before, if there's an error, we'll send back an error message. If somehow there is no person in the database with that name, we'll send back a message. Otherwise, we're ready to update that person in the database. We'll get the person's age out of the body of the request, out of the form, and we'll set the age property in our person object accordingly. That person object, remember, was passed as a parameter to our callback function. So now we've updated the object. Now let's write it to the database using person.save. You may recall from the last lesson that save allows us to write to the database. Well, because this object already came out of the database, calling save on it will just update it. If any error occurs in updating it, we'll send back an error message. Otherwise, we'll render the updated.ejs page, passing it the updated person as the argument. Finally, we see views/updated.ejs, and we'll just use the EJS syntax to print out the person's name and their updated age. To summarize, in this lesson we've seen how we can use the find function to select all documents in our collection, and we can pass a query object to select only certain ones, and we can use the findOne function if we know that we're only going to get one document or one object back. Once we have the document, we can update it using the save function.